Sign the mansion over to your sister. We're done discussing this. That mansion belongs to me. Grandma Helena left it to me. Your grandmother made a mistake, and you're going to fix it.
The bank already has the appraisal scheduled. This is just paperwork at this point.
You scheduled an appraisal on a house you don't own.
Not yet.
I just want what's fair, Camille. You have your career, I have nothing.
Sign it, or lose your family over a house.
My mother slid that folder across the table like it was already settled. My sister stood there with her eyes down, performing helplessness she had rehearsed 100 times before. And Colin smiled the way men smile when they believe the hard part is already over. He had scheduled a bank appraisal on a house that was still legally mine. He had already told lenders Tessa would be the new owner. He had built an entire financial rescue plan on the assumption that I would fold the moment my mother told me to. What none of them saw was the contract I had signed earlier that morning. So what exactly were they about to lose? If you've ever been the one in your family who was expected to give up the most simply because you were the most capable of surviving it, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Rosemere House was never supposed to be mine in the way people assume when they hear the word inheritance. It wasn't a windfall. It wasn't a reward. It was 90 years of stone and silence sitting on 11 acres outside Asheville, North Carolina, and the only reason my grandmother Helena left it to me was because I was the only one who ever treated it like something alive. I was 26 the first time I understood what she meant by that. It was a fall afternoon, the kind where the light comes in sideways and turns everything gold. Helena walked me along the western porch, her hand trailing across the stone wall the way you'd greet someone you hadn't seen in a while. She stopped at a section near the corner where the surface had gone dark green with age and told me not to ever let anyone paint over it. She said that moss had taken 20 years to grow. One coat of paint and it would be gone in a day. I stood beside her and looked at that dark green patch and tried to see what she saw. It took me a long time to understand that she wasn't asking me to see the moss. She was asking me to understand why someone would want to preserve it in the first place, why the slow, unglamorous accumulation of time on a surface could matter more than a fresh coat of paint that made everything look new again. I didn't fully understand her then. I thought she was talking about the house. It took me years to realize she was talking about something harder to name the difference between a thing that has been lived in and a thing that has simply been owned. Helena spent more than 4 decades at Rosemere. She raised her children there, buried her husband there, and outlasted every person who ever told her the property was too much for one woman to manage. She had grown up in a family that treated houses as investments, as markers of status, as things to be traded up or traded out when circumstances changed. Rosemere was the first property she had ever chosen for herself, and she had chosen it not because it was impressive, though it was, but because the first time she walked through its rooms she felt, as she once told me, like the building already knew her. She said that was a ridiculous thing to feel about a structure made of stone and timber. She said it anyway. When Helena's health started failing, I was the one who came back. Not every weekend, not dramatically, just consistently. The way you show up for something you've decided matters. I paid the property taxes when they came due. I hired the contractor who reshingled the east wing after a winter storm took out a section of the roof. I spent 3 months navigating the permit process with the County Historic Preservation Office just to get approval for updating the electrical system without disturbing the original plaster walls. The inspector came out twice and spent 40 minutes explaining why certain modern conduit configurations were incompatible with a 1930s build. I listened to every word and took notes and came back with a revised plan that satisfied his requirements and still got the work done. I kept the garden alive because Helena had asked me to, and I kept the records because someone had to, and I did all of it without asking anyone in the family for help or acknowledgement because neither was ever offered. My mother, Marjorie, visited when it was convenient. She would arrive for a long weekend 2 or 3 times a year, walk through the rooms making appreciative noises, sit in the garden with a glass of wine, and leave without having touched a single task on the maintenance list. My sister Tessa came less often and with more commentary. She called Rosemere our family home at every holiday gathering, usually right after asking when we were going to do something with all that space. By do something, she meant convert it, develop it, use it in a way that generated some visible return. She said it with the casual authority of someone who has strong opinions about property they have never maintained. Neither of them had ever written a check for the place. Neither of them had ever spent a weekend pulling invasive vines off the garden fence or arguing with a preservation inspector about the correct grade of mortar for a 1930s stone foundation. Neither of them had sat across a desk from a county official and explained, in patient detail, why a historic designation mattered and what it required of the current owner. I had done all of those things, repeatedly, over the course of several years, and I had done them because I believed Rosemere was worth the effort. Not as an asset, as a place. When Helena died, her attorney read the will in a small office in downtown Asheville. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is waiting to hear something that will change their understanding of what happens next. Rosemere House, the full 11 acres, and all its contents went to me. Not split between me and Tessa, not held in a family trust with conditions attached. To me, outright and without condition. The attorney said Helena had been deliberate about the language. She wanted there to be no ambiguity. There was plenty of ambiguity anyway, at least in my mother's mind. Marjorie didn't contest the will. She wasn't the type to make a scene in a lawyer's office. She preferred to apply pressure in smaller, more sustained ways. But she started saying things in the weeks that followed. Small things, the kind that don't sound like pressure until you hear them enough times that you begin to recognize the pattern beneath them. Things like, one day you'll have to think about your sister. Things like, Helena always wanted this family to stay close. Things like, a house that big shouldn't belong to just one person. She never said any of these things as accusations. She said them the way you'd mention the weather, as observations, as gentle reminders of a reality she expected everyone to eventually accept. I let those comments pass because I had learned, a long time ago, that arguing with Marjorie about fairness was like trying to level a table by shortening one leg at a time. You never actually got anywhere. You just ended up with less. I didn't move into Rosemere after Helena died. My work kept me in other cities. I consulted on historic preservation projects, assessments, and restoration plans for old buildings that people wanted to save but didn't know how. The work suited me. I had spent enough time at Rosemere learning the particular patience required to preserve something old that I had developed a practical fluency in the language of deterioration and repair. I knew how to look at a building and identify what was cosmetic and what was structural. I knew how to tell a client that the thing they wanted to restore wasn't the building itself, but their memory of what the building once represented, and that those were two very different projects with two very different budgets. I traveled often enough that setting up a permanent home at Rosemere didn't make sense yet, but I had a plan for the property. A real one, not the vague someday intentions that Tessa liked to gesture toward when the subject came up. I wanted to convert part of the outbuildings on the east side of the property into a training center, a place where people who wanted to learn the actual craft of architectural restoration could come and develop the skills that were disappearing from the field. Masonry, millwork, historic plaster, the kind of knowledge that lived in hands and couldn't be downloaded or summarized in a manual. Helena would have liked that. She always said the saddest thing wasn't when old buildings fell down. It was when nobody remembered how to put them back up. Tessa's engagement changed the atmosphere around Rosemere the way a slow leak changes a room gradually, and then all at once. She met Colin Vance at some industry event in Charlotte. He ran a company that organized high-end weddings and corporate events, the kind with 3 photographers and a curated cocktail menu and a venue coordinator who charged separately from the catering. He was charming in the way that people who need things from you often are: attentive, warm, just interested enough in your opinions to make you feel seen without ever actually listening to what you said. The first time I met him, at a dinner at my mother's house about 3 months after Tessa introduced them, he shook my hand and told me Rosemere was the most extraordinary venue he had ever seen. He had only seen photographs at that point. He used the word venue anyway, not home, not property. Not even estate, which would at least have acknowledged that people had lived there. Venue. Like it was already a backdrop waiting for an event to fill it. Within a few months of the engagement, Colin had apparently told half his clients that he was expanding into an exclusive estate location outside Asheville. He showed photographs of Rosemere at industry meetings, photographs he had taken during a visit I had not been informed about, using access that Tessa had arranged without asking me. He described the grounds, the stone architecture, the Helena garden, the views across the valley. He positioned Tessa as the future owner, which she enthusiastically confirmed to anyone who asked, because by then she had started to believe it herself with the particular conviction of someone who has been told a story so many times they can no longer remember that they didn't author it. My mother thought the whole idea was wonderful. She started talking about Rosemere the way you talk about a problem that's about to be solved, with a relieved, forward-looking energy that made clear she had never fully accepted that the property was mine to decide what to do with. "It would be so good to see the place used," she would say. "It would be so good to see Tessa settled somewhere beautiful." She said these things in my presence, directly to me, with the particular confidence of someone who has decided that the person they're talking to will eventually come around. She never once asked me what I thought. She didn't ask because she already knew, and because my opinion had never really been the deciding factor in anything where Tessa's happiness was involved. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and a set of drawings for a restoration project in Virginia, a 1920s mill building that a developer wanted to convert into offices while preserving the original timber frame. My phone rang. A man introduced himself as a property assessor and asked to confirm his appointment at Rosemere House for the following week. He wanted to prepare documentation for a loan application. He mentioned the amount almost in passing, the way people mention figures they assume you're already familiar with. $2.7 million. I told him he had the wrong number. He read back my name. He had the right number. After I hung up, I sat very still for a long time. The drawings were still spread across the table. The coffee was getting cold. I looked at the mill building elevations and thought about how much work it had taken to convince the developer that preserving the original frame was worth the additional cost. Then I started making calls. What I found over the next 2 days was not complicated, once you saw it laid out. Colin's company had been struggling for over a year. 2 of the venues he had exclusive event contracts with had closed, one due to a lease dispute and one due to a fire that the owner had not rebuilt from. A supplier he owed a significant amount to had sent a formal demand letter 6 weeks earlier. A separate business loan he had taken out 18 months prior was past due by 3 payments. The company's bank account, according to documents Reed would later obtain, had less than $40,000 in it at the time Colin was scheduling appraisals on an 11-acre estate. The company was not expanding. It was drowning quietly and methodically, and Colin needed a significant asset to use as collateral before the water got any higher. Tessa had told the lender she was in the process of becoming the owner of Rosemere. She had said it like a fact, not a hope. The loan structure Colin had drafted used the property as security against the full amount. If the business failed, and based on everything I was reading, it was a matter of when, not if, the lender would have a legal claim against Rosemere. The house Helena had spent 40 years in. The garden she had planted by hand along the south-facing slope. The moss on the western wall that had taken 20 years to grow. I drove to my mother's house that evening without calling ahead. I sat across from her at the kitchen table where I had sat 1,000 times before and told her, in plain language, exactly what I had found. I watched her face as I spoke. She didn't look surprised. She looked the way people look when they have been caught in the vicinity of something they knew about but hoped wouldn't become a conversation. Not guilty exactly, more like inconvenienced by the timing. She said Colin's business just needed a bridge. She said Tessa loved him, and that counted for something. She said that I had been given an entire estate while Tessa had been given nothing comparable, and that this was Helena's mistake to correct, not hers to live with indefinitely. She said all of this without raising her voice, without visible agitation, with the practiced calm of someone delivering a position they have rehearsed in private. She used the word fairness the way she always said it, like it was self-evident, like it required no further examination, like the only relevant question was how much I was willing to give and not whether I should have to give it at all. I asked her directly whether she had known about the loan application. She didn't deny it. That was the moment I understood that this was not a situation that had gotten out of hand. It was a plan. A slow, patient, thoroughly organized plan that had started long before that Tuesday morning phone call and had assumed from the beginning that I would eventually comply. Because I always had before, because the architecture of our family had been built around that assumption for as long as I could remember. The engagement party was held at a restaurant in downtown Asheville, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and candles on every table and a menu that changed with the season. I went because Tessa was my sister, and I was still trying, at that point, to be someone who could separate what was happening with Rosemere from what I felt about her as a person. The effort was not entirely successful, but I made it. About an hour into the evening, while Tessa was across the room accepting congratulations from someone I didn't recognize, my mother appeared at my side. She steered me, with practiced casualness, toward a quieter corner near the bar where the noise from the main room was slightly muffled. She had a folder with her. I recognized the format immediately. I had seen enough property documents in my professional life to identify a transfer agreement at a glance. She set it on the ledge between us and told me, in the same even tone she had used at her kitchen table, to sign it over to Tessa before the end of the week. I looked at the document. I looked at her. I asked what she thought would happen to Rosemere if Tessa used it as collateral and Colin's company went under. Colin appeared before she could answer. He had clearly been watching from somewhere across the room, waiting for the right moment to join the conversation. He straightened his jacket, moved to stand at the edge of our small circle, and told me this was already handled. The bank had everything it needed. My name on the transfer document was the last missing piece. He said all of this the way you'd walk a junior colleague through a process they were unnecessarily complicating, patient, a little condescending, with the underlying message that the real decision had already been made and my role was simply to catch up. I asked him how he had scheduled a bank appraisal on a property he didn't own. The smile didn't disappear. It shifted into something flatter, something with less warmth behind it and more calculation in front. He looked at me with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to stop performing and start applying pressure, and he said, "You're making something simple into something difficult." He said it quietly, without raising his voice, and that was somehow worse than if he had been loud about it. Loud would have meant he was rattled. This kind of calm meant he had already categorized me as a manageable problem and was simply adjusting his approach. Tessa appeared a few minutes later, moving through the room with the fluid ease of someone who is the center of an event and knows it. She took my hand and told me she just wanted what was fair. She said I had my career, my work, my independence, my whole life set up exactly the way I had chosen it. She said she had nothing, no house of her own, no foundation, nothing that felt permanent. She said the word nothing softly, with just enough weight behind it to make it land as an accusation rather than a description. I picked up the folder. I told them I would look it over. I said goodnight to Tessa, who hugged me with the warmth of someone who has already decided the outcome of the evening. I said nothing to Colin. I walked out of the restaurant into the cool night air and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to think without anyone watching my face while I did it. I had two options, and I understood both of them clearly. I could keep fighting this inside the family, arguing, explaining, producing evidence, appealing to my mother's sense of fairness, and waiting for her to eventually extend that sense in my direction. I already knew how that ended. I had spent 34 years watching how it ended. Or I could remove Rosemere from the equation entirely in a way that no transfer document and no bank appointment and no family dinner could undo or reverse or reframe as a negotiating position. I had been in contact with Blue Laurel Preservation Trust for almost 2 years. They were a private conservation organization that had approached me not long after Helena's death about acquiring Rosemere. Their interest was genuine and specific. They had done their research on the property's history, the architectural details, the condition of the land. They wanted to preserve the building, maintain the acreage, and open part of the space for educational programming in historic trades. Every time they had reached out, I had told them I wasn't ready. I had always believed, on some level, that I would eventually find a way to fulfill my plans for the property myself. Sitting in that parking lot, I called Reed Kessler. He was my attorney and had managed everything related to Helena's estate from the beginning. It was late, but he answered on the third ring. I told him I was ready to move forward with Blue Laurel. I told him I wanted the contract drafted and ready to sign before the end of the week, he asked, with the careful neutrality of a good attorney, whether I was certain. I told him I had never been more certain of anything in my professional or personal life. What I didn't say, because Reed already understood it, and because saying it out loud felt like more weight than the moment needed, was that I was not selling Rosemere to punish anyone. I was selling it because I had finally accepted that the only way to keep the promise I had made, not to my mother or my sister, but to Helena herself, was to put the property somewhere beyond the reach of people who saw it as a resource to be divided. Blue Laurel would preserve the stone walls. They would maintain the western porch. They would protect the garden along the south slope and the moss on the corner wall that Helena had spent 20 years cultivating. And in doing that, the training center I had always imagined would be built anyway, by people who shared the same understanding of what Rosemere was actually for. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat. I didn't open it again. In the morning, I would call Reed back to confirm the details. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the drawings for the Virginia Mill building and thought about what Helena had said about the moss, that it had taken 20 years to grow, that one careless decision could erase it in a day. She had not been talking about paint. She had been talking about exactly this. Reed had the contract with Blue Laurel Preservation Trust ready within 48 hours. I reviewed every clause at my kitchen table the same way I had reviewed every permit application and every restoration proposal I had ever worked on carefully, without rushing, looking for anything that didn't hold. The terms were exactly what I had hoped for, and in some places better than I had expected. $6.8 million for the property and all 11 acres. No demolition of any existing structure. No subdivision of the land during the conservation period, which was set at a minimum of 30 years. The garden Helena had planted along the south-facing slope would remain intact and be maintained according to a preservation plan that Blue Laurel's horticultural consultant would develop in the first year. A section of the outbuildings on the east side of the property would be allocated for architectural restoration training programs, open to apprentices and working tradespeople. The thing I had always wanted to build at Rosemere would be built there anyway, by an organization with the resources and the mandate to sustain it, just without my name on the deed. I signed on a Thursday morning. Reed filed the conditional sale agreement before noon. I drove to a job site in Western Virginia that afternoon and spent 4 hours looking at water damage in a 19th century farmhouse that a preservation society wanted to stabilize. The work was detailed and absorbing, and I was grateful for it. By the time I got back to my car, it was nearly dark. By Friday evening, my mother knew. I wasn't in the room when she found out. I didn't need to be. Tessa called me first, which surprised me, only briefly. She was always the one who moved fastest when the family's emotional temperature changed. She started talking before I had finished saying hello, and she continued talking over every attempt I made to respond, which told me she wasn't calling to have a conversation. She was calling to establish a position. She said I had made a decision that affected everyone without consulting anyone. She used the word betrayal more than once, which I found remarkable given everything I now knew about what had been assembled behind my back over the previous several months. I let her finish. Then I told her, in the same even tone I had used with my mother at her kitchen table, that the property was mine, the decision was mine, and the sale was legal. She hung up before I could say anything else. My mother called 20 minutes later. Her voice had a quality I recognized from childhood, not loud, not sharp, but pressurized, like something being held together by sheer force of will from the inside. She said I had sold the family home. I told her I had sold my home. She said those were not two different things, and I understood then that we had been having two completely separate conversations for years, possibly for decades, using the same words to mean entirely different things, and that no amount of precision on my part was going to change what she had already decided was true. She said she needed time to process this. I told her I understood. We ended the call without resolution, which was how most of our significant conversations ended. What I had not fully anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated and simply not wanted to examine directly, was the extent of what Colin had already set in motion before any of this became a legal matter. Reed called me the following Monday with information that reframed everything I thought I already understood about the situation. Colin had not merely been hoping to use Rosemere as collateral at some future point. He had built an entire operational plan around it, a detailed and apparently well-developed business strategy that treated the property as an asset already within his reach. He had signed contracts to host 3 separate weddings at Rosemere events scheduled for the following spring and summer, with specific dates and specific couples who had paid deposits based on the understanding that the venue was available and under Tessa's ownership. He had created a promotional portfolio using photographs of the property that he had taken during a visit to Asheville that Tessa had arranged months earlier, without informing me that anyone would be on the property or that photographs would be taken for commercial purposes. He had circulated that portfolio to vendors, caterers, florists, and rental companies across western North Carolina, describing Tessa as the future owner of the estate and positioning Rosemere as the flagship location of an expanded event business. One document Reed obtained through the discovery process described the property as the crown jewel of a regional venue network. Another listed Rosemere's projected annual rental income as a primary component of the company's financial recovery projection. All of this had been assembled and distributed before my mother had ever placed that folder on the table at the engagement party. Before she had ever said the words, "Sign it over." The timeline was not ambiguous. The plan had been in active development for months before I was officially asked to participate in it. The whole performance, the folder at the engagement party, the public setting designed to make refusal feel like a scene, the appeal to fairness and family loyalty, even Tessa's carefully calibrated insistence that she just wanted what was right had been the final step in a process that had started long before I was invited to be part of it. They had never been asking for my permission. They had been creating the appearance of a deliberative family process, so that when I eventually signed, it would look like a mutual agreement reached through reasonable discussion rather than what it actually was. A transfer of an asset obtained under sustained social and emotional pressure. I sat with that understanding for a long time after Reed and I finished the call. There is a particular kind of anger that doesn't feel like anger at first. It feels more like clarity, like finally being able to see, with full resolution, the actual shape of something you have been looking at from the wrong angle for far too long. The blurriness resolves, and suddenly you can see every edge. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't raising my voice to an empty room. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the late afternoon light, understanding with a precision I had not previously had exactly what had been constructed around me, how long it had taken to build, and how many people had participated in its construction. The count was higher than I had wanted it to be. The news of the sale moved through the extended family quickly. Within days, I had become, in the telling, the daughter who had sold her grandmother's home for personal gain, the sister who had pulled the ground out from under Tessa on the eve of her wedding, the one who had always been difficult, always put herself first, always needed to win whatever room she was in. I heard 3 separate versions of this story from 3 different relatives within a single week, each version slightly different in its details, but identical in its conclusion, which told me the narrative had been distributed deliberately and rapidly, coordinated in advance, before I had the chance to offer any account of my own. Tessa, meanwhile, hired an attorney. She filed for a temporary injunction to halt the transfer of Rosemere to Blue Laurel, arguing that she had a legitimate legal claim to the property that superseded my right to sell it unilaterally. Her argument rested on several pillars. First, that Helena had verbally expressed on multiple occasions a wish for Rosemere to remain within the family. Second, that various family members, including Marjorie, had contributed to the upkeep and maintenance of the property over the years and therefore had an equitable interest in it. Third, and most critically, that I had made explicit and repeated promises to Tessa that she would share in the ownership of Rosemere at some point in the future, and that she had made decisions and plans in reasonable reliance on those promises. That third argument was the one that had teeth, because Tessa had something to support it. She produced an email one I had sent her nearly 2 years earlier, in the weeks after Helena's funeral, in which she claimed I had written that Rosemere would always belong to the 2 of us. She presented this to her attorney as evidence of a binding commitment. Her attorney presented it to the court as grounds for a freeze on the sale pending a full hearing. What I actually remembered writing was different. After Helena's funeral, Tessa had sent me a long, emotional message about the house, about their shared memories of it, about how much it meant to her that the property would stay in the family. I had replied inadequately, in retrospect with something meant to be comforting. What I had written was that Rosemere would always belong to our family's history. A statement about meaning, about legacy, about the way a place becomes part of who you are even after it changes hands. Not a legal commitment, not a promise of co-ownership. A sentence written in grief by someone trying to offer comfort that had been held in reserve for nearly 2 years and then modified before it was shown to anyone else. Here's what I learned later and what ultimately mattered in court. That email had not been forwarded to Tessa's attorney in its original form. I had replied directly to Tessa's personal email account. She had the original reply sitting in her inbox. She also had, apparently, the technical capability and the motivation to alter the text of that reply before presenting it as evidence. The modification was small, a single phrase changed from our family's history to the two of us, but it transformed a statement of sentiment into something that could be read as a contractual commitment. She had done this, Reed would later confirm, at some point in the 14 months between when I sent the email and when she submitted it to her attorney. The original metadata from the email server would tell the whole story, but I didn't know that yet on the morning her attorney filed the injunction. The court granted a temporary freeze on the transfer pending a full hearing. Blue Laurel's representative called Reed the same afternoon to say that their board remained committed to the purchase, but that they were bound by the terms of the conditional agreement. If the legal dispute was not resolved before the closing date specified in the contract, they had the right to withdraw from the transaction entirely. The property would revert to its current status, legally mine, financially burdensome, and no longer protected by an active sale agreement. The cracked mortar along the east garden wall that I had been meaning to schedule a mason for over the past several months was now completely inaccessible to me. With the legal freeze in place, I couldn't authorize any maintenance or repair work on the property at all. I could only wait. My mother called several times during that period. She did not call to ask whether I was all right or to express any concern about what the legal process was costing me in time, money, or psychological endurance. She called to ask whether I had considered settling, offering Tessa a meaningful portion of the sale, proceeds in exchange for her dropping the injunction and allowing the transaction to proceed. She framed this as the practical solution, the path that allowed everyone to move forward without further damage. She used the word reasonable, with the particular inflection she reserved for positions she had already decided I was obligated to accept. I told her I would think about it. I was not thinking about it. Then the second piece landed, and it was the one I had not seen coming. Tessa's attorney submitted a signed and notarized statement from my mother to the court. In it, Marjorie stated that she had personally witnessed me make an explicit promise to Tessa that Rosemere would eventually be shared between us as co-owners. She described a specific occasion, a family dinner approximately 2 years prior, in which she claimed I had told Tessa directly that the house would always belong to both of us. She stated that she had understood this to be a genuine commitment at the time, and that Tessa had subsequently made plans in reliance on it. She signed her name to all of this and had it notarized by a public notary in her county. I read the statement, sitting in Reed's office, in the same chair I had sat in when we had first discussed the sale. I read it once and then read it again, not because I had missed anything the first time, but because I needed a moment to fully absorb what I was looking at. I had spent years building a set of interpretations that made my mother's behavior comprehensible. She was complicated. She had always struggled to be equally fair to both her daughters. She loved Tessa in a way that sometimes expressed itself as favoritism, but was ultimately rooted in genuine care. Reading her notarized statement, I found that those interpretations no longer held the weight I had been placing on them. Not because she had chosen Tessa over me, she had been doing that in various forms my entire life, and I had made my peace with it, or thought I had. But because she had chosen to formalize that choice in a legal document, signed under oath, designed to be used against me in court, that was a different category of action. That was a decision made with full awareness of its consequences, and made anyway. That evening, I drove to her house for the second time without calling ahead. She opened the door and looked at me with the particular expression she wore when she had anticipated a confrontation and had already prepared her position in advance. I asked her, without accusation in my voice, whether she was prepared to stand in front of a judge and repeat under oath what she had written in that statement, whether she was prepared to testify that she had personally heard me promise Tessa a share of Rosemere. She said she was protecting the child who needed her most. A memory came back to me standing in her doorway. I was 19 years old and Tessa was 15. Tessa had been upset about something that seems genuinely minor from this distance, a school trip she had not been allowed to attend, some small social disappointment that had expanded in the telling until it felt enormous. My mother had pulled me into the kitchen, away from Tessa, and asked me in a low voice to give Tessa my spending money for the month. Not a loan with any expectation of repayment, a gift freely given to smooth over a feeling. She had said, "You're older, you can handle it." I had given the money without protest, because I was 19 and because it seemed like a small thing and because I had already learned, at some level I couldn't yet articulate, that resistance to these requests produced more friction than compliance did. Standing in that doorway 15 years later, I understood that moment differently than I had at 19. That was not the first time my mother had taken something of mine and redirected it toward Tessa's comfort. It was simply the first specific instance I could recall with full clarity. And the pattern had not stopped after that evening in the kitchen. It had continued in various forms and at various scales for the next 15 years. It had scaled up so gradually that each individual instance seemed manageable: a month's spending money, a concession at a holiday gathering, a silence where there should have been an objection, until one day the cumulative weight of all of it was sitting in front of me in a notarized legal document, and the total had reached the value of an 11-acre estate. I drove home without saying anything else. There was nothing left to say to her that night that would have changed anything, and I had learned over many years to stop spending words in conversations where they could not land. I called Reed when I got back and told him I was not settling. I was not offering Tessa a portion of the proceeds in exchange for her cooperation. I was not going to pay to resolve a problem that I had not created. I told him that if there was any way to demonstrate that the email had been altered, I needed him to pursue it with whatever resources were available. Reed said he had already initiated that process. He had submitted a formal request to the email service provider for the original metadata associated with the message, the technical record of when the email was created, when it was last accessed, and whether its content had been modified after it was initially sent. Digital metadata of that kind was difficult to falsify and impossible to explain away if it showed a discrepancy between the send date and a subsequent modification date. If the email had been changed after I sent it, the record would show exactly when the change was made and what it affected. While we waited for the metadata report, Blue Laurel's deadline continued to approach. Colin, apparently undeterred by the legal freeze, continued operating as though the outcome were already determined in his favor. He was still in contact with the vendors he had engaged for the 3 booked weddings. He had not refunded any of the deposits the couples had paid. He had sent at least one follow-up communication to a florist describing the estate deal as temporarily delayed due to a routine legal review. He was, in other words, still treating Rosemere as a business asset that was temporarily inconvenienced rather than a property he had never had any legal right to promise to anyone. The worst part of that period was not the legal uncertainty, though that was significant. It was not the financial pressure of ongoing property taxes and maintenance obligations on a building I could not touch. It was the silence from people I had known my entire life. Cousins who had spent summers at Rosemere as children, who had eaten at Helena's table and walked her garden and understood, or so I had believed, what the property represented to our family. Family friends who had watched me drive back to Asheville repeatedly over the years to handle one maintenance crisis or another, who had seen with their own eyes the work I had put into keeping the place intact. None of them called to ask for my account of what had happened. They had received a version of events from my mother and from Tessa, and had accepted it because those were the sources they trusted, and because the version they had been given was simpler and more emotionally satisfying than the truth. I understood during those weeks that the narrative my family told about me, difficult, self-interested, unwilling to share, needing to win, had been in circulation long before this particular dispute. Rosemere had not created that story. It had simply provided the story with its largest and most dramatic illustration. Reed called me on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days before Blue Laurel's contractual deadline. He said he had received the metadata report from the email provider. He said I needed to come to his office the following morning. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was afraid of what the report contained. I was fairly certain, by that point, of what it would show. I didn't sleep because I understood that what Reed had found would change the shape of every conversation I had with my family for the rest of my life, and I had not yet arrived at a full accounting of what I was willing to lose in order to stop pretending that the family I had was the family I had always believed it to be. I was still, in some small and stubborn corner of myself, hoping the report would show something that made the situation less clear-cut. Something that left a little room for a version of events where my mother had been deceived rather than complicit, where Tessa had made a mistake rather than a choice. I already knew, rationally, which version was true. But knowing something rationally and being ready to act on it without reservation are 2 different things, and I had not yet fully closed the distance between them. Reed's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Asheville, with windows that looked out over the river. I had been there enough times during the estate process after Helena died that the receptionist knew my name and my coffee order. That morning she handed me a cup without asking. I carried it down the short hallway to Reed's office and sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair I had sat in when we first discussed the conditional sale agreement, when everything had still felt like a manageable set of legal steps rather than the accumulated wreckage of a family that had been building toward this moment for longer than I had wanted to admit. Reed opened a folder with the particular deliberateness of someone who has significant news and wants to deliver it in the right order. The metadata report was 12 pages. He had tabbed the relevant sections with small yellow markers. He walked me through the first relevant passage, which appeared in the middle of page 4, in language that was technical but not difficult to follow once you understood what you were looking at. The email Tessa had submitted to the court had been modified after it was originally sent. Not rewritten entirely, that would have been both too obvious and too risky, since a wholesale rewrite would have changed the metadata signature in ways that were immediately detectable. What had been done was smaller and more precise. A single phrase had been changed. The original text, the one I had typed and sent in the weeks following Helena's funeral, read, "Rosemere will always belong to our family's history." What Tessa had presented to her attorney, and what her attorney had subsequently presented to the court as evidence of a binding promise, read, "Rosemere will always belong to the two of us." 7 words had been replaced with 6. The modification was small enough that someone reading quickly might not notice it. It was large enough to transform a statement of emotional consolation into something that could be argued, in court, as a contractual commitment to shared ownership. The timestamp on the modification was 14 months after the date the original email was sent. That placed it well within the period when Colin had already begun preparing his loan application and collateral documentation, and several months before my mother had ever placed the transfer folder on the table at the engagement party. The sequence was now fully visible. The email had been altered. Then the financial groundwork had been laid. Then the family pressure campaign had been mounted. Then, finally, I had been presented with the folder at a public event where refusal would look like a scene and compliance would look like a family agreement. Reed set the metadata report aside and opened a second folder. He had subpoenaed financial records from Colin's primary lender as part of building the legal defense, and what came back was more detailed and more damaging than either of us had anticipated. Colin had not begun preparing the collateral documentation for Rosemere in the weeks before the engagement party, or even in the months immediately following the engagement announcement. He had begun 11 months before the evening my mother produced the transfer folder. There was a preliminary loan assessment in the file, dated from nearly a year prior to that evening, that listed Rosemere House as the proposed primary security asset for a loan of $2.7 million. In the lender's internal notes, someone had written that ownership transfer from C. Rourke to T. Rourke was anticipated prior to closing. Anticipated, not hoped for, not pending negotiation. Anticipated as though it were a scheduled administrative step that would be completed in the normal course of business, like a title search or an environmental assessment. There was also a business recovery projection document bearing Colin's signature. It was 43 pages long and laid out a 5-year plan for restoring his company's financial position. Phase 1 of that plan was described as asset acquisition via family transfer, with a projected timeline that corresponded almost exactly to the period between the formal engagement announcement and the date of the party where my mother had presented me with the folder. The document described Rosemere in terms of its revenue-generating potential event hosting capacity, projected seasonal booking rates, estimated annual income from venue rentals, and incorporated those projections into the company's forward financial model as though they were already secured. The document had been prepared, according to its own internal dating, before Tessa had ever spoken to me about the property. Before my mother had ever suggested, in any conversation I was part of, that signing over Rosemere was something I should consider. I sat with both folders open in front of me and looked at the river through Reed's window for a moment. The water was moving quickly after a week of rain, running brown and fast between the banks. I thought about the engagement party, about the way Colin had stood beside my mother and told me this was already handled, about the particular quality of his calm, not the calm of someone who is confident in the justice of their position, but the calm of someone who has done the work in advance and is simply waiting for the last piece to fall into place. I asked Reed what all of this meant in practical terms for the hearing. He said it meant several things. It meant that Tessa's injunction had been filed on the basis of fabricated evidence that the email she had presented as proof of my promise had been materially altered from its original form, and that the alteration was now documentable and demonstrable through forensic metadata analysis that would be difficult for any opposing expert to credibly refute. It meant that the financial records from Colin's lender established a pattern of premeditated planning that predated any family discussion about the property, which directly undermined the argument that the transfer request had arisen organically from a legitimate family concern about fairness. And it meant, Reed said carefully, that Colin had significant potential criminal exposure for fraud, for misrepresentation to a lender, and potentially for his role in the alteration or use of the modified email, depending on what further investigation produced. He said he wanted to present all of it to the judge at the hearing the following week. He said he believed the injunction would be lifted. I left his office and sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time. The engine was off. The garage was dim and smelled of exhaust and concrete. I was not overwhelmed in the way I had been in the early days of this, the disorienting, destabilizing overwhelm of discovering that people you trusted have been working against you. I had moved past that somewhere in the middle of the previous 2 weeks, in the grinding daily work of managing a legal dispute while trying to maintain a professional life and a functional relationship with my own thoughts. What I felt sitting in that garage was something different and, in its own way, harder to sit with. I had driven to Reed's office, still carrying a small, stubborn reserve of hope. Hope that the metadata report would show something ambiguous, a technical anomaly, a software glitch. Something that could be explained in a way that left my sister's actions in a less deliberate light. Hope that the financial documents would reveal confusion rather than calculation, that Colin's planning had been optimistic and presumptuous rather than fraudulent. That reserve was gone now. What the evidence showed was not ambiguous. It was clear and sequential and damning, and it had been assembled by people who had believed, with apparently good reason, that I would never look closely enough to find it. What replaced the hope was not rage. Rage would have been simpler and in some ways easier to carry. What replaced it was something quieter and more permanent, the specific, irreversible sensation of a door closing on a version of your family that you had been choosing, for a very long time, to believe was still recoverable. I had known, rationally, for years that the relationship between my mother and me was structured around a particular and consistent imbalance. I had known it and managed it and worked around it and told myself it was something I could live with because the alternative, fully acknowledging it and acting accordingly, felt like a loss I wasn't ready to absorb. I was ready now. The readiness had not come from a decision. It had come from the accumulation of evidence until the weight of it made any other position untenable. The hearing was held the following Tuesday in a courtroom in Buncombe County. Reed presented the metadata analysis first, walking the judge through the technical findings in plain, accessible language, pausing to ensure that the key points were clearly understood before moving forward. He presented the original email and the modified version side by side, formatted so that the changed phrase was immediately visible. He presented the lender's internal assessment with the anticipated transfer notation highlighted. He presented Colin's business recovery plan with the asset acquisition timeline clearly marked. He presented my deed to the property. He presented Helena's will, with the specific language she had used to ensure clarity of ownership. He presented 3 years of financial records showing that I, and only I, had paid every property tax bill, every maintenance invoice, every contractor fee, every permit application cost associated with Rosemere, from the date of Helena's death to the date of the conditional sale agreement with Blue Laurel. Tessa's attorney argued that the metadata analysis was a technical document that required expert interpretation and could not be taken at face value, that the financial records related to Colin's business were not directly relevant to the question of whether I had made a promise to Tessa, and that my mother's notarized statement, combined with the email as submitted, was sufficient to establish the existence of a reasonable expectation of co-ownership that the court should protect. He presented these arguments competently and without visible uncertainty, which I respected even as I understood they were not going to be sufficient. The judge listened to both sides without expression. At the end of the hearing, he said he would issue a written ruling within 5 business days. The ruling came in 3. The injunction was lifted in full. The court found no credible legal basis for Tessa's claim of ownership or of promised co-ownership of Rosemere House. The ruling noted that the deed was unambiguous, that Helena's will had expressed clear and deliberate intent, and that the evidence presented by the petitioner in support of an alleged promise, specifically, the email, had been flagged as a document of questionable authenticity that the court could not rely upon as proof of a binding commitment. Reed told me afterward that flagged as a document of questionable authenticity was a carefully chosen phrase, the legal equivalent of the judge, saying he believed the email had been altered without wanting to make a criminal referral from the bench on the same day he issued the civil ruling. That referral, he said, might come through a separate channel. He said I should be prepared for that possibility. I told him I was. I called Blue Laurel's representative that same afternoon. She said the board had been monitoring the timeline closely and was prepared to move immediately. We confirmed the closing date for 10 days out. Reed handled the remaining documentation. On the day of closing, I drove to a law office in Charlotte, sat across a conference table from Blue Laurel's legal team, and signed my name to the final transfer documents. Rosemere House and all 11 acres passed to Blue Laurel Preservation Trust for $6.8 million. I did not feel the relief I had expected to feel. I had imagined, during the weeks of legal uncertainty, that the moment of closing would feel like setting down something very heavy after carrying it for a long time. What I actually felt was closer to the particular exhaustion that follows sustained tension, not the release of the tension itself, but the body's gradual recognition that the state of high alert is no longer required. My hands were steady on the pen. My voice was steady when I thanked the Blue Laurel team for their patience through the legal delay. Their representative told me that Rosemere was exactly the kind of property their organization had been built to protect. She said Helena's name with the quiet respect of someone who had done thorough research and understood what she was talking about. That mattered to me in a way I had not anticipated, more than the number on the closing documents, more than the legal victory, more than almost anything else that had happened in the preceding months. My mother called that same evening. I answered because I had made a decision in the weeks prior that I was not going to handle this situation by withdrawal or avoidance. Disappearing from difficult conversations was what you did when you were ashamed or frightened of the consequences of your own position, and I was neither. She said she had heard the sale had gone through. There was a flatness in her voice that was different from her usual controlled composure, something that might have been exhaustion, or resignation, or something she was working to keep from becoming audible. Then she said that regardless of what any legal document said, the fair thing, the right thing would be to give Tessa at least half of what I had received from the sale. She said the property had always been a family asset in every meaningful sense, and that a legal technicality should not determine how the proceeds were distributed among the people who had a genuine connection to it. I told her that fairness was not the same as taking from one person to compensate for every choice made on behalf of another. I told her that the version of fairness she had always practiced had a consistent and specific direction it moved toward Tessa and away from me, and it had been doing that for long enough that she had stopped experiencing it as a choice and had started experiencing it as the natural order of things. I told her that I understood why she had made the decisions she had made, that I did not believe she was a malicious person, and that none of that changed what I was and was not going to do. She said I was being cruel. I told her I was being accurate, and that in my experience, the two things felt similar from the inside when you had been on the receiving end of someone else's accuracy for a long time and had not expected them to eventually return it. She didn't respond to that. After a moment, she said she hoped, in time, I would see things differently. I told her I hoped she would too. I ended the call, set the phone on the counter, and stood in my kitchen for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Colin's legal situation deteriorated rapidly in the weeks that followed the closing. Once the court documents became part of the public record, the couples whose wedding deposits he had collected began making inquiries through their own attorneys. 2 of them filed formal complaints. Additional vendors came forward with unpaid invoices. The picture that assembled itself from the public record was not simply of a business that had failed, but of a pattern of conduct overpromising, collecting deposits on venues he did not control, leveraging other people's assets to support commitments he could not meet that had been repeating itself across multiple transactions over several years. Rosemere had been the largest and most audacious iteration of that pattern. It had not been the first. Tessa ended the engagement 4 months after the closing. I heard it from a cousin who delivered the information with the particular energy of someone who expects the news to produce a visible reaction. It didn't produce the reaction he was anticipating. What I felt was not satisfaction. It was something more complicated, a kind of sorrow for the version of Tessa who had genuinely believed, at some point in this process, that Colin's plans for Rosemere were also plans for her, that the venue business and the estate and the wedding they were planning were all part of a coherent future. He was building for both of them. At some point, she had stopped being a partner in that future and had become a mechanism for accessing an asset, and I was not certain she had fully understood when that transition had occurred. But I also understood that Tessa had made her own choices throughout this process. She had altered an email. She had filed a legal action based on that altered email. She had stood in a restaurant and performed distress while a plan was being executed around her that she had not been uninvolved in constructing. The fact that she had also been used, at some level, by the person she trusted most in that arrangement did not erase her own agency within it. She would need to reckon with those choices on her own. I was not going to absorb the consequences of them as I had absorbed so many other things over the years. I was finished with that particular form of love. My mother continued to reach out in the months that followed. She did not apologize directly, she was not built for direct apology, and I had made my peace with that limitation long ago. What she offered instead were approaches, calls to check in, invitations to dinners framed as ordinary family occasions, small gestures that were really requests to return to the version of our relationship that had preceded all of this. I responded to some of them and declined others. What I did not do was return to the arrangement in which my silence and my compliance were the price of her comfort. I told her once, in plain language, that I was willing to maintain a relationship with her that did not include discussions of money, of what I owed Tessa, or of what the family collectively believed I should have done differently. If she could sustain a relationship within those parameters, I was there. If she found those parameters impossible, I understood, but they were not subject to negotiation. She found them difficult. I had expected that. Blue Laurel began the formal restoration work at Rosemere the following spring. I visited once during the early phase, when the scaffolding was still up along the north face and the interior rooms were being assessed for preservation potential. The project manager walked me through the work plan room by room. The cracked mortar on the east garden wall had already been repaired by a mason who specialized in period stonework. The south-facing slope, where Helena's garden grew, was being cleared of the overgrowth that had accumulated during the months of legal uncertainty, and a horticultural consultant was developing the long-term maintenance plan that the sale agreement had required. The outbuildings were being adapted for the training programs, carefully, without altering the original structural elements. Near the end of the tour, the project manager led me to a small room off the main hallway, a room I had always thought of as a study, though Helena had used it for various purposes over the years. Blue Laurel had designated it as a permanent interpretive space, a room that would tell the history of the property and the family that had built and lived in it. On the door, mounted on a piece of reclaimed wood taken from one of the original interior window shutters, was a small brass plate engraved with 2 words, Helena Room. I stood in front of it for a long time. The hallway around me was quiet in the specific way that old stone buildings are quiet, not empty, not hollow, but settled, as though the walls had absorbed enough living over enough decades that they no longer needed to assert themselves. I thought about the western porch and the moss and the fall afternoon when Helena had stopped walking and turned to show me something I didn't yet have the framework to understand. She had not been teaching me about the house that day. She had been teaching me about what it meant to recognize the value of something that took a long time to grow and could be destroyed in a single, careless afternoon. She had been teaching me, in the particular oblique way she had of teaching things, about the difference between protecting something and simply possessing it. I had sold Rosemere. I had signed my name to a document and transferred the deed to an organization I had not built and would not control. And standing in that hallway in front of a brass plate bearing my grandmother's name, I understood with complete clarity that I had not given anything away. I had placed something irreplaceable somewhere it could not be reached by people who did not understand its value. I had done the one thing that guaranteed the moss would keep growing, that the stone would keep standing, that the garden Helena had built over 4 decades would survive everyone who had wanted to reduce it to a line item in a loan application. The training programs launched that fall. The first cohort was 12 people, apprentices and working tradespeople, learning historic masonry, millwork, and plaster restoration in the outbuildings where I had always imagined such a program taking place. The lead instructor sent me a photograph from the first morning, 12 people in work clothes standing in front of the main stone wall of the building, looking up at it, the way you look at something you are about to spend a long time learning to understand. One of them had a hand raised as though asking a question. I looked at that photograph for a long time before I set it on my desk. Not as a record of what I had won, as a record of what had been worth protecting and what it had taken to protect it. If this story stayed with you, it might be because you recognize something in it, the feeling of being the capable one, the dependable one, the one everyone assumes can handle a little more. Being strong doesn't mean you owe anyone your silence or your assets. It just means you're the one who has to decide, eventually, where your limits are. If stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing. Every week, we bring you real accounts of people who found their line and held it.